VCO is a precision active buffer and multiple. It's designed to address the impedance mismatch and tracking problems sometimes encountered between different modules and analog synthesizers, both modern and vintage. For example, you might find that one of your external synths or Eurorack VCOs doesn't track your sequencer or keyboard accurately and appears out of tune across a span of notes, even within a range of a single octave. It's also particularly useful for controlling filters, as many will self-oscillate, allowing them to be used as rudimentary sine wave oscillators. But the tracking is inherently less predictable compared to a purpose-made VCO. Even though many feature a 1 volt per octave input, their accuracy may decrease significantly across multiple octaves or at lower frequency ranges. 4 of the VCO's 5 outputs can be adjusted up or down by plus or minus 5% from the front panel, so that VCOs and VCFs that don't track a 1 volt per octave signal exactly can be easily compensated to track correctly, without having to recalibrate the module or the synthesizer itself. It has a very high input impedance coupled with a very low output impedance and an offset voltage of less than 1 millivolt. This allows very precise control over tracking adjustments, and by the use of trimmers as opposed to surface mounted pots, the risk of accidentally moving one of the controls and losing a fine adjustment is eliminated. The VCO will also function as a highly accurate buffered multiple for distributing an incoming CV to multiple destination where accuracy is important, such as pitch control of multiple VCOs, where a simple passive multiple could compromise the strength and precision of the CV signal, as multiple VCOs would add increasing load affecting the 1 volt per octave tracking. However, the low output impedance of the module will also allow the use of additional passive multiples placed after it in the CV signal chain, making sure that such a drop in signal integrity doesn't occur. And, unlike many regular buffered multiples, it can also correct impedance issues coming from the outputs of other instruments, sequencers and controllers, which might otherwise prevent the VCOs or other 1 volt per octave modules and instruments they're controlling from tracking a 1 volt per octave signal accurately. The main purpose of the adjustable outputs on the VCO is to compensate for VCOs or external instruments that aren't tracking 1 volt per octave signal correctly. From the point of assembly, the mini-mod VCOs track very well, especially when you take into account the vintage circuitry design that they're based on. But if for some reason you find yourself with a VCO that doesn't track properly, whether it be a mini-mod or of another brand, then using the adjustable outputs of the VCO can correct this. All the VCOs I have here track correctly, but you can also use this to adjust the tracking on a filter when it's self-oscillating. If a filter can self-oscillate, you can use it as a sine wave oscillator, but how well they track varies greatly by the design. They're inherently less accurate and stable than a purpose-made VCO, but some of them will track very well and just perhaps need a little bit of tweaking here and there. At the moment you're listening to a square wave coming from this VCO, and it's going into the first VCF on the Gemini and then into the VCA. And the second filter on the Gemini I've set to self-oscillation, and because I'm using the dual output on the Gemini, I can get a mix of the output of both of these filters. So that's the output of the first filter, which is just the sound of the VCO with no resonance and the filter wide open, and the output of the second filter, which has no input. The input levels turn all the way down, so you can't hear the VCO through this one. You can just hear the filter self-oscillating. So I'll adjust the mix so you can hear that as well. And that's just the filter self-oscillating. So if I create a pretty even mix of the two and then try to tune them, we'll try to tune the filter pretty close to the VCO. Oh, that's pretty good. So if I play octaves, you can hear at that higher octave it's just out slightly, and if I go up another one, and play some other notes, I've got the output coming from this first adjustable output on the V scale, and I'll see if I can bring the Gemini's self-oscillating filter into tune with the VCO. Generally the Gemini does track very well when it's in self-oscillation compared to the transistor ladder filter, which really struggles to track at low frequency settings, whereas the Gemini does very well. So this is compensating for the tracking of a VCF, but the procedure would be exactly the same with a VCO. At the moment you're listening to the sawtooth output of the Mother 32, and this is tuned to C2. Simultaneously I've also got this Minimod VCO going via the muting mixer into the external audio input of the Mother 32. So if I change this mix pot, you'll hear the sound of the Minimod VCO. And I've got the output of this VCO going into this tuner. So if I turn the mix up to about 50% of both, so if I change the octave that this is outputting, it will also change obviously the tuning of this VCO, and you'll see the difference in the tightness of the tuning reflecting in the tuner. So if I go up one octave, you can see now that the output of that VCO is slightly detuned, it's gone out of tune, it's slightly flat. And you can hear it as well because you can hear the two waveforms beating against each other. If I go up a second octave to C4, you can hear it's much more significant, and the difference will double with every octave. So up another one. And then back to normal. So to fix this problem with the V scale, I'll take this 1 volt per octave signals coming from the keyboard out of Mother 32, put it into the input of the V scale, and then take a cable from the fixed output of the V scale and go into the 1 volt per octave of the VCO. I'll have to retune that a little bit. So that's pretty good. Now when I go up an octave, two octaves, and you've got to make some allowances for there being some tuning difference between the two pots, because it's just impossible to get them absolutely spot on. So what's happening here is, by the VCO being connected to that keyboard output, it's pulling down its output slightly, meaning it's affecting that 1 volt per octave output signal, so it's not quite reaching the voltages that it needs to produce accurate octaves. I can demonstrate this even further by loading more VCOs onto the CV signal coming from the keyboard output. Normally we wouldn't use a passive multiple for copying CV signals that are used to control pitch, but because the VCO has an extremely low impedance output, it makes the use of passive multiples totally viable for this kind of usage. And the same is true of the CV output of the glider noise module. The issue here is that if we add a second VCO using a passive multiple, this will firstly double the load on the output of the mother 32, and so as a result it will need to provide double the current. And then, because of the impedance mismatch, the drop in pitch CV will also be double, and so this will make the tracking error twice as bad. Right, so there's a mix of two VCOs, and still at C2, and that's relatively well tuned. But look what happens when I add a second VCO by putting this multiplied 1 volt per octave signal into the next 1 volt per octave input, the next VCO. As you can hear, that's affected the tuning. And when I add a third, I sent the tuning completely out. But if I use the V scale again, take the output of the V scale into the multiple. Add the first VCO and adjust its tuning. Then add the second VCO. Then add the third. This basically allows you to use a passive multiple to control multiple VCOs as part of your voice. So now if I play octaves. It's worth noting that using an active or buffered multiple to fix this kind of tracking error might not necessarily work. The advantage of the V-scale is that it's got a very high input impedance and a very low output impedance, and it's specifically designed to fix pitch tracking problems.